Divided the agenda here in two parts. First, what we've learned about employee resilience in the aftermath of the Canterbury earthquakes, meanings of resilience. So being resilient is a lot more than just bouncing back from adversity. The role of organizations in developing resilient practices and mindset, and looking a little bit into recovery trajectories and how much of that we can transfer to the current context. And then we seamlessly, and now I can't move the presentation. Hang on. You know, the whole thing where the slides
okay.
move.
Sorry.
No worries. There it is here. Okay. Looking into these recovery trajectories, but also very specific lessons about resilience development. And I hope I don't get too political. I get a little bit passionate about this part, but we'll get to it. So at the time of the Canterbury earthquakes or post-quake, there were specific research questions that guided our research. And if we look at these three questions, I find that, well, we're asking a lot of the same questions right now. What are organizations doing to survive, recover, and thrive to the crisis? What's distinguishing or will distinguish resilient businesses from struggling businesses? And then what does a resilient employee look like in this context, and how can we further develop employee resilience? So the same questions I think hold, and there's a space to further explore them in this context. I know I have some really talented master students looking into this right now in the tourism industry and in other spaces as well. And I'm sure Katarina is also looking. It's nearly impossible now to do any field research in IO-Psych without surveying employees who are currently undergoing this crisis and organizations that are in a kind of a response plan stage. So we'll get a lot of new information. Hopefully in a year or two, we'll have a really fresh, interesting presentation to give. So just to quickly recap our understanding of resilience, because we're asked that a lot still for some reason. So there's that traditional conventional view of resilience, which is very much trait-based and linked to coping responses, the ability to bounce back from adversity and show kind of a positive response after exposure to adversity. We do acknowledge that there is a trait and developmental, from a developmental psych perspective, component to resilience and what makes people resilient more or less. But we also take a transformational and ecological approach to the construct. So we look into it not just as something that is inherent in individuals and develop over the course of a lifespan, but something that interacts with the environment and the resources provided by the environment. So on the one hand, resilient individuals behaviorally display the ability to continually develop and adapt to external circumstances, even in the case of exposure to adversity. And they also display behaviors that signal that they are identifying, utilizing, and even generating new resources in a workplace context. So that's a little bit different than just bouncing back or coping with the crisis. So just very quickly to recap, employee resilience, we'll define it and then measure it as a set of adaptive learning and network leveraging behaviors. So it's a capability, not merely a trait or attitude, although there's an underlying resilience trait and a generally positive attitude towards challenges. So the whole glass half full, or there's no such thing as a dead end. I'll take a solutions-focused approach to the problems that are presented, but we're looking at it in terms of a capability. So beyond the attitude, what do I actually do in the workplace to resolve these conflicts, to address these challenges? And the critical element here is that employee resilience has to be supported by the organization. So there's something about the context of an organization, and we'll get to that in a second, that will render individuals more or less resilient. And I gave the example earlier today, elsewhere, of an individual, perhaps in a leadership position, that is placed in an organization that provides no support or very little support, and they are maybe inherently resilient or have display high levels of trait and attitudinal resilience. There's still an obstacle to their ability to display adaptive learning and network leveraging behaviors. You place that same individual in a different, more supportive organization, and they're able to display those competencies and perform at the highest level. So it's not just about the individual, it's about also the content in which they're embedded. So how can organizations develop resilient practices and mindset? The evidence from our previous research suggests that, well, a couple of things, that if we take this trait-based or individual-centric view of employee resilience, we are missing a significant opportunity to maximize resilience development in an organization. So essentially, we're taking this approach that, and the question that we're asked multiple times, and I think Katarina here has been asked before, can we hire for resilience? Can we recruit or have recruitment and selection processes that hire for resilience? And our question is, you could, but that's not going to solve the issue, or that's not going to make the most of or contribute to resilience development in your organization. So it's a real missed opportunity to focus on the individual at the expense of creating and having an enabling context. And the other side of it is that the individual-centric or trait-based approach is quite unhelpful. And I use this as a euphemism, I guess, because it does give organizations the space to disavow their own responsibility for employee resilience and well-being and their development in general. So by taking a trait-based approach, essentially what we might be communicating to organizations is this is about the person, it's not about the organization. It is the employee's responsibility to make the most of things, regardless of the challenges or regardless of the resources that are presented to them. And so, yeah, that's absolutely an unhelpful narrative that we are trying to break down, unfortunately, till this day, because that is still the leading approach to individual resilience. So our evidence also suggests that there's a lot of value, and when I say value, I mean in terms of return on investment, on benefit for organizations, from identifying specific organizational environments. So we're looking at things like climate and culture, but also practices and spanning the whole HRM spectrum that either promote or undermine resilient behaviors. And this is most of the work that our team has been doing over the years. So identifying these critical factors. And because we've had the privilege of conducting longitudinal research, we could see that they are mutually enhancing. So resilient organizations with these enabling contexts promote resilient behaviors, which in turn further contribute to resilient organizations. So that's kind of the cycle of resilience and enhancing cycle of resilience that we see. I want to just add a little curveball. This is, let me have a sip for that one. So it's something that we haven't commented before in previous presentations, and it's this notion of egalitarianism in resilience development. So something that I think has been coming up, particularly in the post-pandemic or the pandemic context, is that there are significant structural inequalities in New Zealand and worldwide, but let's focus on New Zealand. And we're talking about financial inequalities and social inequalities. That is the backdrop against which resilient organizations and employees develop and unfold. By acknowledging those, we are also in a better position to understand the limits of enabling factors. And I can give you a very quick example when we're talking about individuals displaying career resilience. There's a great difference between someone who's in a position to take a step back in their career, reflect on where they want to go next, perhaps take some risks with regards to their career because they are in a good financial, social position to have the backing to engage in those proactive learning and perhaps risk-taking behaviors. A lot of other individuals are not in a position to do that, even with or despite organizational support. But this is exactly where organizational support becomes so important, and why the notion of resilience we present here is somewhat egalitarian. And I color-coded it egalitarianism in green, so that in the next slide, where I showcase the model that I was looking at before, the mutually enhancing model, if we look at these elements that are the promoting factors of resilience that we identified in research, being clear about one's role and how it impacts the overall team and organization, having a learning culture, so mistakes are viewed as learning opportunities rather than something that should use with a punitive end, focusing on employee well-being and providing social support, peer and leadership. These things are generally inexpensive to implement. It's more part of a mindset that can quickly and easily be embedded into the practices of any organization. They don't require massive financial investment. You see on the right-hand side there, I note leadership and infrastructure as well. Those might be the elements that set apart the organizations that have the financial means to invest more in leadership development, or perhaps in the technology infrastructure that enables some of these promoting factors. But by and large, it is possible for even your run-of-the-mill nonprofit organizations, small startups, to have these enabling factors in place. So in that sense,
so there's other things.
Yes. If you click, click, click. Oh, it's not showing up there? Aha. It's like, what is this? This woman speaking. So those are the factors that our research highlighted as enabling factors across organizations and across sectors. And the positive outcomes were adaptability or innovation, employee well-being, lower turnover, not just the intention, but actual turnover, higher engagement, and voice. So people feeling like they have the ownership of their contributions to the organization, and a sense of psychological safety, which is to be desired and builds resilient organizations. Right. So in the lead-in to the kind of the lessons that transfer from earthquake research to our lockdown and post-pandemic situation, we've identified three main, I guess, resilience and recovery trajectories. Keep in mind that earthquakes were a multi-crisis or a multi-incident event or adverse event. Our curve for the COVID pandemic was a spike culminating with the lockdown period. And then we were able to progress down the different levels, 3, 2, and 1, and resume some semblance of normalcy, unlike most other countries in the world, so we're in the privileged position that we should seize. But the three trajectories that we identified in the earthquake research were organizations that were struggling in the first year or two and ended up failing, organizations that struggled, sought help, or changed something about their context and their systems and were able to recover. We worked alongside quite a few of those, and organizations who went straight to recovery mode and were able to thrive. Those were the exemplary organizations. The characteristics of the recovering/thriving organizations were precisely the characteristics depicted in the model in the previous slide. So when they displayed those enabling factors, they showed greater resilience from an employee standpoint, but also the organization at large. And they were able to innovate and quickly adapt to the environment. Right, so moving on to what kind of knowledge transfers. I almost wanted to have this slide and the one that comes next side to side, but that's not going to be possible. That's too tech. Right. So things we learned from the Canterbury earthquakes really broadly, that the recovery trajectories, but also the impact on businesses is diverse. From business to business, from sector to sector, so not all industries were affected equally, and then even within businesses, but across regions. So, and this one is quite obvious because we had a region-specific disaster. What we learned was that the fact that these experiences were unique, and at the time, as a nation and as a broader business community, we were somewhat ill-prepared. There were some significant oversights and failure to support people and organizations who were worse hit due to this difference in perspective. We now know that due to this diversity, we need to attend to business-specific and sector-specific challenges and have a course of action that is responsive to those characteristics.
Can you give some specifics?
Yes, well, in some of the organizations that we worked with, they were not located exclusively in the Canterbury region. Some of them had subsidiaries and indeed headquarters outside of Canterbury. And there was a massive disconnect between the performance expectations, but also recovery expectations. As soon as something is out of the news cycle, it's almost like it's gone. So it was not unusual to have teams in Christchurch struggling in seeking support, help, and a bit of relief for performance targets from teams and subsidiaries in Wellington or Auckland. Was like, well, why do you need this for? The earthquakes are done and dusted. Now we have a much better idea that because it's out of the news cycle doesn't mean that it's done and dusted.
Also, it's everywhere in the country.
So. Yes. But now we have a shared experience and makes it a little bit easier. But still, if we look at it from a global perspective, our experience is still unique relative to the rest of the world. So that will have implications as well.
Yeah, which shows in terms of the lack of willingness to accept the recent cases because somehow we're all
in the
done
happy,
here and
yeah.
The rest of the world still got it, but we're all right.
and we're good. We have them in hotels. We're good. Yeah. So the key findings here were that there are two forms of support that really were essential or critical in surviving and thriving organizations. Support from within in the form of leadership that, and these are points we'll make later on, staying on top of employee health and well-being, and ensuring clarity and alignment through change. This is kind of the bonus track of the slides at the end. I don't need to go over all that if we get a bit tired. But there's a second point that is quite important. It was the point of external support. So for some organizations, having support from others through alliances of similar business or complementary businesses, and also support from government agencies enabled them to recover and build resilience. So there's that within factor, which is the one we operate more closely with. But then the external support, which we cannot disregard and is essential to the context we are currently in. So if I run a parallel between that and the lockdown and the aftermath, so the post-pandemic context, there's similarly a very diverse impact and recovery trajectories within New Zealand. One class, or I guess one example that is salient is tourism and hospitality industry versus infrastructure organization in terms of their ability to function, to reopen, to restore business. Some of them didn't close at all, some of infrastructure organizations. And we see it also from a regional perspective. somewhere in the news a few weeks ago, there was a piece about significantly lower consumer spending in large urban centers compared to the smaller communities. So there is area or regional-based impact that is unique, but also business impact or sector-based impact that is quite unique. But now we know this.
I think the news is saying 40% of the Canterbury workers were essential workers.
Yeah,
so they work right through.
exactly.
So, yeah.
So,
rural workers who are just unimpacted.
Yeah. Stay away from the cows.
It's pigs at the moment.
so if we look into a recent, and I say recent, the past 2 months, there's quite a bit of interesting work coming out of even high impact peer reviewed journals about what do we do about this COVID-19 thing. And we see a lot of commonalities between what they're calling for in terms of the examination of impact of these factors and what we've been able to observe and already establish from the earthquake research, managing well-being, attracting and retaining talent, managing workload. When I say job design, it's not just a work of reinvention, but anything from structuring virtual teams and investing more in virtual teams to fundamentally changing the way we do businesses to become more flexible, and perhaps at least one of our audience members here could speak to the idea of revisiting and restructuring the rewards and recognition packages for employees to recognize not just your role-related performance, but a lot of the discretionary behaviors that we will no doubt be relying on through the recovery process. And the second part of it, which I mentioned already, is acknowledging unique circumstances for businesses and regions. So in the case of the global pandemic, disruption to supply chain, which we had somewhat briefly in the aftermath of the earthquakes, but we'll have again on the global scale in the current crisis, retaining and managing customers and clients, so maintaining that base and still growing the customer base, and navigating the uncertainty around reopening restrictions and how much risk you can take with the businesses. Again, a little bit outside the scope of what I do and what we do, but something to consider as part of the contextual factors that we should take into account. Right. Do we want to talk before I move? I feel like I'm talking a lot. Maybe that's part of what I'm doing here. That's the gig, isn't it?
What slide are we up to?
B2.
B2, cool.
So not a whole lot more. Okay, so I thought of just giving a little summary of some of the approaches, the tried and true approaches to resilience development that worked in the region and might work in our post-pandemic environment and beyond. As I mentioned earlier, staying on top of employee health and well-being. Why? To build capability, and not just because the health and safety manager says so. And there's a lot of value in this. How can we do it? Ongoing assessment. So some organizations have taken the time to do pulse checks on their staff, checking on their well-being, on pressing challenges and job demands, and try to nip those as quickly as possible, even during the lockdown period. That's good practice, and it signals that the organization cares and is willing to invest in their employees beyond or in addition to financial gain and maintaining that healthy bottom line. Staff recognition. It is always important to recognize or to acknowledge staff, even in recognition is by its very nature intangible, but for pro-social and proactive behaviors that are linked to these resilience behaviors. So speaking positively about the organization, and we need that to retain customers, to grow the customer base, to attract talent to the company, and also by being proactive, but I'll say more about this in the innovation piece. Civility, I know that Katarina's currently doing a fair bit of work on workplace civility and how that, again, inexpensive change, slow but inexpensive change in the environment and the culture of the organization can go a very long way to attracting, retaining talent and maintaining the well-being and performance of staff, clarifying norms, and also relying on exemplars to highlight what happens when you have a workplace characterized by civility, what might happen when you have incivility in the workplace, so the health and performance aftermath of that. Other areas that I guess we're both working on at the moment is the evaluation of both primary and secondary well-being interventions. So primary focused on things like job redesign, trying to make the most out of and get some participation from staff in terms of job crafting. In essence, reinventing roles and jobs to reinvent the organization beyond that notion of agility. And then the secondary well-being interventions, mindfulness interventions, either face-to-face or online, which is kind of picking up momentum at the moment. And people do appreciate that, but particularly if they are employee-led. And the final point I want to make here about staying on top of health and well-being is a point about belongingness and engagement. Through all this, it's easy to lose our sense of footing, of how we are individuals yet connected to a broader organizational system, the whole meaning of the workplace and being at work. So reiterating these connections, again, the sense of impact and contribution, why do you matter as an employee, is quite important, particularly from a standpoint of maintaining well-being and the mental health of staff. And it sounds really fluffy, this idea of belonging as a balance of attention between individuality and connection to the bigger system, but it is extremely important to enabling this or creating this sense of meaning and holding people firmly to something to ride the storm, essentially. And I guess the last set of points I want to talk about are about developing resilient behaviors through clarity and alignment through change. Again, change like this, uncertainty, potentially mayhem. How do we keep a clear direction for staff? So creating a sense of common purpose, momentum for the change. Some companies will definitely need to reinvent themselves, and continuing to develop capability. So not feel like they are stuck and in constant reactive mode, or just have to wait for something to happen, hold on, and take minimal to no risks. So how can that be done? Clear communication of long-term challenging or changing goals. Understanding that if the company is about to go into restructuring mode as part of their response plan, how do employees fit with that plan? What's in it for them? So create a sense of this is not just about the business wanting to salvage itself and stay financially afloat. How are we carried along, but also how are we agents of the change? So active participants empowered to provide significant contribution. So, and that goes along with the idea of communicating impact, reiterating, because those linkages might have been broken or disrupted, the linkages between the individual role, team performance, and organizational performance throughout all these changes. And getting us to the last point there, also communicating a resilience mindset and behavior. So bringing back, I think post-earthquake resilience became a bit of a word that people got fed up with, but we do need to bring it back into the organizational discourse. And a few ways in which we can do that is to highlight and bring to the fore the idea of organizational paradoxes, these contradictions that we need to balance. One of them between transformation and continuity. So how much of what we hold near and dear in terms of our values and our culture do we get to retain, our very identity, but also facilitating and being part of a change that could fundamentally transform our organization. And then within the same point, promoting innovation. So highlighting the trade-offs between taking risks, which we tend to be averse to at a time like this. We kind of hold on to the resources we have, but really highlighting the trade-offs between a modicum of risk-taking and resource depletion, because taking risks and being innovative requires a bit of resource utilization. But how that can feed into organizational survival and thriving. Not just staying afloat and not continuing to struggle for years to come, but how can innovation really carry us forward? And through the enactment of resilient behaviors, how can we push through it? So taking the company from a place of reactive improvisation, which can be really good serendipitous occurrence in a time of crisis, to deliberate, proactive learning and agility. And through resilient behaviors, I think we can get to that space, which is a lot less haphazard and more deliberate and far more embedded in the culture of the company. Thanks for